The laws changed drastically in the 1920s and really closed off the immigration flow in large part until it was reopened again in 1965. The Immigration and Nationality Act was modified and a lot of the restrictions lifted, and two basic principles guide our immigration system. That is family reunification, people who can say they have family members here, especially immediate family, and skills level for various occupations. That's kind of the big picture, but there is a very important exception. Mexican migration. So the country that's our largest source of immigrants. We'll see high 20, 27, 28% of all immigrants are from Mexico. Have been coming in large numbers for about 100 years. Now, not to this part of the United States, mainly elsewhere, to the southwest and the west, and a little bit in the Midwest and Chicago. There's been a long-standing community there. But they came as temporary workers, and there have been special programs to allow them to come legally during times of economic prosperity in the 1920s, and then during the labor shortage in the 1940s and the war, and then a legal program called the Bracero program that allowed workers to come temporarily stayed in place until 1964, and upwards of 450,000 Mexican temporary workers a year were able to come legally under that program. Now, when the economy was down, say in the 1930s, there was 1 million Mexican immigrants and some U.S. citizen family members who were forcibly deported. So that's kind of a typical cycle in American history. When the economy's bad, there's a lot more pressure against immigrants, and in this case it was a large group. And when the economy's good, people and the society as a whole generally is more welcome. So the other thing to keep in mind in looking at immigration is it's a kind of a two-sided coin in a very simplistic sort of way. There are push conditions in people's home countries that compel them to leave. The reasons they want to leave. Most people would prefer to stay in their home countries. They don't want to leave and come to a strange land. They'd like to be able to make a living in their home countries to support their families and stay without the threat of violence. But they feel compelled to come to this country because of great hardships. And there is a pull on our side of all the opportunities that America has to offer, particularly in the labor market, but also safety and asylum from persecution. And so let's talk about unauthorized immigrants as a portion of this. About 28% of all immigrants are here unauthorized or are here illegally without visas. About an estimated 40% of them do come with visas, and they overstay them once they expire. The others come initially illegally, most often over the U.S.-Mexico border. You can see the numbers there have really gone up, and actually the numbers have gone up from about 3 million in the early 1990s to about 12 million at the start of the economic recession, and then just kind of leveled off and have gone down slightly during the recession. Unauthorized immigration tends to be very sensitive to labor market opportunities in the United States, because that's the main reason people are coming. And where are they coming from? About 59% are from Mexico, and then another 15% or so are from Central America. So about 75% are from our close neighboring countries that we have these long-standing ties with. There are 4.5 million children in the United States who have an unauthorized immigrant parent that are U.S. citizens. Right? Those unauthorized immigrants, the phenomenon that's very common in immigrant communities are mixed status households, where somebody's here with permission, maybe a legal permanent resident, maybe a citizen. Someone is here without permission, is here illegally. Other members in the household are very fearful that person may be taken away from them. And then others are born here and are U.S. citizens. But in general, the impact, and we can look at more specific data, but a lot of it was summarized in Maryland, the state of Maryland, along with a number of other states, have attempted to assess the impact of immigration on their state, especially in states that have more recently become larger receiving centers. Much of the South, this has been the case, North Carolina, Georgia, and so on, as well as Maryland. And a number of Midwestern states now are receiving immigrants, a large number that really hadn't for many decades. And these states have come up with the assessment, especially focusing on unauthorized immigrants. And they found that, on the whole, immigrants consume more services at the state and local level than they pay taxes. They pay property taxes if they're renting or if they're homeowners. They're paying sales tax, and unauthorized immigrants are estimated by the Social Security Bureau to pay 2/3 of them are paying Social Security taxes, most often using the fake ID or a fake Social Security number. They have a large file in the Social Security where for people with names that don't match the numbers. And at present, the most recent report on that from the Social Security Administration was that unauthorized immigrants were contributing somewhere between an estimated $120 billion and $240 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund, which is roughly between 5 and 10% of the Social Security Trust Fund. And in the most recent year for the data, 2010, had contributed $13 billion to the Social Security Trust Fund. And it's very hard for unauthorized immigrants to ever collect that money because they're contributing it, they're not here legally. So that's mostly a net benefit to Social Security Administration. So they're paying more in at the federal level than they consume in federal services. Most of the services that all of us consume in our lives are mainly funded more often by state and local taxes. Primarily, especially for this population, education for their children. That's the biggest social service expense. And in Maryland, a report was done by a group that's fairly hostile to immigration, or certainly not pro-immigrant, Federation for American Immigration Reform, FAIR. And they estimated that about $1.3 billion was spent, or $1.2 billion was spent on services for unauthorized immigrants beyond what they paid in services. $900 million of that was for education, and education for their children. And many of those children are U.S. citizens, not all, but many. Between the states and localities are absorbing more of the cost, and the federal government's getting more of the revenue from the taxes that they pay. The state of Texas did find that for Texas, unauthorized immigrants paid more in state taxes than they consumed in state services. At a comptroller's report from 2006. That was kind of surprising. Most states have found that immigrants pay between 30 to 70% in taxes of the services they consume at state and local level. At about the 10 or so states that have tried to assess this. In terms of the overall impact on the economy, for immigration as a whole, and including also for unauthorized immigrants, the benefit tends to be quite positive for the most part, or at worst, kind of net neutral. There is some competition for lower skilled workers, but usually only in times of economic downturn is there much of a significant effect. During normally prosperous economic times, the net economic impact, even on low skilled workers, is quite minimal. Okay, let's look a little bit at this area, the Eastern Shore, what's happened in population trends. And this is data for the Hispanic population in the Eastern Shore. And Hispanics include citizens as well as immigrants. And there are lots of other immigrants besides Hispanics, of course, but they're the largest group. And in our area, and in Maryland generally, the vast majority of Hispanics are foreign-born, are immigrants. Nationally, about 40% of Hispanics are foreign-born. Asian Americans, about 66% to 70% are foreign-born. That's the highest immigrant group in terms of percentage. But what's going on here is you can see a lot of growth, particularly your county, Talbot. Going from really tiny numbers in 1990 to almost no presence to several thousand people by 2010. One of the common issues that people are most concerned about is immigrants coming and they don't speak English and it's hard to communicate and it creates all sorts of frustration and barriers. And basically what this is showing us is that the population that's under 18 is much more likely to be bilingual. Those who are foreign-born but under 18, they're learning English. They're going to school, they're learning English. The older population that are adults are much less likely to be bilingual. They're more likely to speak English with great difficulty. And the research shows typically that there's a 3-generation language learning pattern in American history. It doesn't matter what the immigrant group is, for all of the non-English speakers. If the first generation speaks enough English to get by, but mainly this is their native language. The second generation is usually bilingual, speaks both. And then the third generation, 80 to 90% of each group becomes monolingual English speakers. We're a nation of immigrants, but with a great amount of diversity, but this is a country, it's been said, where languages come to die. You come and you speak English. You can see that Hispanics, generally people from Spanish-speaking countries have higher, again, Central and South America, not so much South America, but Central America and Mexico have much higher dropout rates. And it's gotten better. The dropout rate difference, the gap, has narrowed in 2000 to 2012. And the big news this year, just last year in fact, is that for those completing high school, those who don't drop out, and the numbers have been high for a long time, you know, that it's been like 25%. It's getting down. It's getting much, much lower now. Of those who complete high school, Hispanics go to higher education at a higher rate than non-Hispanic whites. Let me repeat that. 2012, Hispanics went to college, those who finished high school, at a higher, just a tiny bit, right, like 1 percentage point higher than non-Hispanic whites. So they're right about even, and Hispanics were just a little ahead. So that gap is really narrowing for those who are going through the school system, who are making it through the school system. It is some of the negative kind of discouraging trends we've seen for a long time can change. And just lastly, I wanted to look at some of there's some crime issues. Victimization crime is much higher for immigrants than it is nationally. About double. 21% said they had been victims of crime. Yet, a lot of them are very reluctant to contact the police because they fear even being a witness or reporting a crime could make it more likely that they will be deported. So, and then there are a lot of language barriers with the police, different agencies. Different agencies have responded to that in different ways, though. There have been some attempts to rectify it. So those are some of the kind of common struggles that people have faced, and what some of the big picture is national. Different agencies have responded to that in different ways, though. There have been some attempts to rectify it. So those are some of the kind of common struggles that people have faced, and what some of the big picture is national.